Imagine being faced with a split-second decision that could change everything. What would you do if you saw smoke rising from a stranger's house and heard a faint cry for help? Would you wait for someone else to step in, or would you risk it all? This is the story of Ethan Stevens, a delivery driver whose ordinary day turned into a test of courage, determination, and heart. As the flames grew higher and the minutes ticked by, Ethan's choice would set off a chain of events no one could have predicted. Was it foolish, brave, or something in between? One thing's for sure, what happened that day will leave you speechless. Stay with us to uncover how a single act of bravery turned one man's life upside down and set him on a path he never saw coming. But before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from, and if today's story warms your heart during this cold winter season. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming and emotional stories. Now, let's begin this journey together. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the quiet suburban street. Ethan Stevens rubbed his eyes as he pulled his delivery van to the curb. The day had been grueling, a series of back-to-back stops, heavy boxes, and long hours spent behind the wheel. He'd worked these shifts countless times, but today the exhaustion felt heavier, like bricks tied to his shoulders. His van sputtered as he turned off the engine, the silence almost jarring. Ethan sighed, glancing at the passenger seat where a small cardboard box sat with an address printed clearly across the label. One last stop. Across the street, a row of neatly trimmed hedges lined well-kept houses. It was a neighborhood built for comfort. Luxury cars in driveways, children's bikes tipped neatly against porches. All right, he muttered to himself, forcing his stiff limbs into motion. He grabbed the package and pushed open the door, stepping into the thick, late-afternoon heat. His uniform shirt clung to his back, sweat tracing lines down his neck. The world smelled of cut grass and sun-baked pavement, but as Ethan took a step forward, his nose crinkled. Burning. Ethan froze. It wasn't the sharp smell of a barbecue or a neighbor's wood stove. It was different. Thick, acrid, like wood catching fire. His brow furrowed as he scanned the houses. Everything seemed normal. Lawns edged to perfection, driveways clean, curtains drawn. But then, almost hidden against the sky, a thin wisp of smoke snaked upward. Ethan turned toward a brick house 2 doors down, its shutters freshly painted blue. From the corner of the roof, dark smoke curled, almost delicate against the clear sky. He paused near the edge of the sidewalk, the package still tucked under his arm, and squinted for a better look. "Do you smell that?" A voice called. Ethan turned to see a man in gym clothes holding a rake. He stood halfway down a driveway, looking concerned but hesitant. "Yeah," Ethan replied, pointing toward the house. "It's coming from over there." The man frowned, his grip tightening on the rake. "Fire department's been called. My wife just did. They're on their way." Ethan glanced back at the house. The smoke was darker now, no longer just a whisper. His gut twisted uneasily. Something wasn't right. "You don't think someone's inside?" Ethan asked, his voice careful. The neighbor shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting to the house before back to Ethan. "I don't know. Could be empty. Best not to go poking around, private property and all." Ethan turned back to the house, his eyes narrowing. His instincts screamed at him. Something in the stillness felt off. People were beginning to peek out from behind curtains and hedges, their faces pale with uncertainty. The street seemed frozen, as if holding its breath. A flicker of orange light caught his eye through the upper window. Flames, small but growing, dancing like cruel shadows against the glass. He swallowed hard. "Wait for the firefighters," the neighbor called again, his voice firmer now, almost pleading. But Ethan didn't respond. He couldn't. Something told him that waiting might be too late. His ears strained as he stepped closer to the house's front gate. At first, there was nothing but the eerie crackle of distant flames. Then he heard it, a faint sound, muffled, weak, almost like a voice calling out. Ethan's chest tightened. "Hello," he called out, moving closer to the tall fence. "Is anyone in there?" The voice came again, barely audible. It sent a chill through him, stark against the heat building around the house. Someone was inside. Hey, Ethan spun to the neighbor. There's someone in there. I hear them. The man's face turned pale. You sure? The firefighters. Ethan dropped the package on the sidewalk, his decision already made. He grabbed the metal gate and pushed it open, the hinges groaning as if in protest. Hey man, the neighbor shouted, stepping closer but stopping short. Don't be stupid. You don't know what you're walking into. Ethan ignored him, his pulse pounding in his ears. The smell of smoke hit him harder now, clinging to the air. He jogged up the driveway, past the luxury sedan parked neatly by the house. The front door loomed ahead, a heavy wooden thing that looked as sturdy as a fortress. Ethan touched the handle and yanked his hand back, cursing under his breath. It's hot. He coughed, the smoke stinging his throat as it thickened. Circling the house, he scanned for another way inside. A side door was locked, and pounding on it yielded nothing. His heart raced, sweat pouring down his face. Think. He stumbled toward a low window on the side of the house, its glass cloudy with smoke. Ethan bent down, squinting through the haze. For a moment, he thought he saw movement. A figure slumped near the floor. Ma'am, sir, can you hear me? He yelled, his voice hoarse. No response came, but a faint moan drifted through the window. It was enough. Grabbing a small planter from the ground, Ethan lifted it over his shoulder. Hold on, he shouted, not sure if anyone inside could hear him. He swung the planter hard against the glass. It cracked but didn't break. Gritting his teeth, he swung again, harder this time. Crash! The window shattered, shards spilling into the room. Heat and smoke poured out, hitting Ethan like a wave. He coughed, pulling his shirt up over his mouth and nose. Hello, he called again, leaning in through the broken frame. The air inside was thick, the heat radiating like an oven. From somewhere deep in the room came another soft cry, fainter now, almost desperate. Ethan's jaw tightened. There wasn't time to wait. He brushed glass aside with his arm, ignoring the sting as small cuts formed on his skin. Hang on, he shouted again. Then, without thinking about what might come next, he hoisted himself up and climbed through the broken window, disappearing into the smoke. The moment Ethan dropped into the house, the smoke swallowed him whole. The air was thick, stinging his eyes and scratching his throat like sandpaper. He crouched low instinctively, pressing the edge of his shirt against his mouth as a makeshift filter. The room around him was almost unrecognizable, dark, hazy, and filled with eerie shadows cast by the faint glow of flames seeping through cracks in the ceiling. He squinted through the smoky veil and saw overturned furniture, a chair lying on its side, picture frames shattered on the floor, and books strewn across a coffee table that had collapsed. Everything felt wrong, chaotic and lifeless, as if the house itself was suffocating. Hello? Ethan shouted, his voice muffled and hoarse. Can you hear me? He paused, listening intently. A faint, broken sound, a wheeze, or maybe a moan, echoed from somewhere deeper inside the house. His heart jumped. Someone was alive in here. Move, Ethan. Move. He kept low to the ground, crawling over debris as heat radiated through the carpet beneath him. The walls creaked ominously, and a soft crackling sound whispered in the background like a distant warning. The fire wasn't far. He could feel it advancing, hungry and relentless. As he reached the doorway leading to the hallway, he placed his hand on the doorframe. The wood was warm, and he recoiled. He pushed the door open carefully with the back of his hand, wincing as a wave of hotter air blasted him in the face. The hallway stretched ahead like a tunnel, choked with black smoke that curled and twisted like living shadows. The faint sound of coughing, a wheeze, came again, more distinct this time, from behind a closed door near the end of the hallway. Ethan focused on it, shutting out the chaos around him. Hold on, he called, his voice cracking. Each step forward felt harder than the last. Sweat dripped down his brow, stinging his eyes, and his chest burned with every shallow breath. The smoke clawed at his lungs, but he couldn't stop now. He pressed forward, feeling along the wall to steady himself as the floor groaned underfoot. When he reached the door, he hesitated. It was partially ajar, smoke spilling out like water through a crack. He pushed it open further and froze. Inside, he saw her, an elderly woman, slumped against a toppled armchair near the far wall. Her gray hair was matted to her forehead with sweat, and her pale face was streaked with soot. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment as she let out another weak cough, barely lifting her hand as if to signal for help. Ethan's heart sank. "Mom, can you hear me?" Her lips moved, but no sound came. He knew she didn't have long. The air here was unbreathable, and flames from another part of the house were drawing closer. He could hear the growing roar of the fire, an unsettling sound, like an angry beast hunting them down. "Okay, I've got you," he said aloud, as much to himself as to her. Ethan rushed to her side, his knees pressing into the hot carpet. "Can you stand?" "Ma'am, I need you to try and hold on to me." Her head moved slightly in a nod, but her body refused to cooperate. Her legs barely twitched when Ethan gently shook her shoulder. She was too weak. He'd have to carry her. Bracing himself, Ethan crouched lower and hooked one arm around her back and the other under her knees. "Hold on," he murmured as he heaved her up. She let out a faint gasp, and Ethan stumbled at the sudden weight. The woman wasn't large, but exhaustion and the thick air made her feel heavier than she was. He gritted his teeth, adjusting her so her head rested against his shoulder. The heat was unbearable now, sweat soaking through his clothes as smoke stung every inch of exposed skin. Ethan turned toward the hallway, only to see his worst fear materialize, flames licking at the edges of the far wall, closing in from where he had entered. "No turning back now. Stay with me," Ethan whispered to the woman as he pivoted sharply, his eyes searching for another exit. His gaze landed on a small window on the far side of the room, partially obscured by heavy curtains. The flames hadn't reached it yet. "Almost there," he said, more to convince himself than her. He staggered toward the window, his legs trembling under the strain of carrying her weight and fighting his own growing dizziness. Each breath felt like inhaling molten air, his throat raw and chest aching. Finally, he reached the window. With a grunt, he turned his back to the glass, using his body to brace the woman while he pulled at the curtains. The thick fabric resisted, snagged on the rod, but Ethan gave it a hard yank, ripping them down in a cloud of dust and ash. Light, blessed light, streamed through the window as the evening sky peeked in, a sharp contrast to the choking darkness of the room. He could hear shouting now, voices outside, people calling for help. "Hey, someone's in there?" Ethan's head spun as he looked out through the window. A small group of neighbors and paramedics stood on the lawn, pointing and waving at him. A firefighter with a helmet and gloves was sprinting toward the house with a crowbar in hand. "I've got her!" Ethan shouted through the smoke, his voice hoarse. "Help me get her out!" "Pass her through," the firefighter called back, positioning himself under the window. Ethan shifted the woman carefully, his arms shaking as he hoisted her closer to the sill. He had to be careful of the jagged edges of glass that still clung to the window frame. "Easy now," Ethan muttered, sweat dripping into his eyes. "We're almost there." Outside, two paramedics joined the firefighter, reaching their arms up. "We've got her!" Summoning the last of his strength, Ethan lifted the woman higher, maneuvering her through the opening. The firefighter caught her upper body while the paramedics supported her legs, carefully lowering her onto a stretcher. "She's out. She's breathing," one paramedic shouted, the relief evident in his voice. Ethan slumped against the wall for a second, gasping for air as the heat clawed at his back. He glanced over his shoulder to see flames creeping into the room, consuming everything in their path. Time to go. He grabbed the windowsill, ignoring the sharp scrape of glass against his palms, and hauled himself up. He swung one leg through the window, then the other, his body shaking as he tumbled out onto the lawn. Cool, clean air filled his lungs, and for a moment, Ethan just lay there, coughing hard and staring up at the evening sky. "You okay?" a firefighter asked, kneeling beside him. Ethan blinked, trying to focus. "I'm fine," he rasped. He turned his head to see the paramedics working over the woman, placing an oxygen mask gently on her face. "She's alive," the firefighter said, as if to reassure him. Ethan nodded faintly, his chest still heaving. He sat up slowly, wincing as his muscles protested. People were staring now, neighbors, emergency workers, strangers, but Ethan didn't care. He looked toward the stretcher as the paramedics wheeled the woman toward the ambulance. Her eyelids fluttered open for a brief moment, her gaze finding Ethan's. "Thank you," she mouthed softly. Ethan's throat tightened as he watched her disappear into the back of the ambulance. He hadn't asked her name, but that didn't matter. She was alive. That was enough. Ethan sat on the cool, dewy grass, his body slumped and his breathing shallow. His chest heaved with every cough, each one scratching his lungs as if they were lined with sandpaper. His arms hung limp at his sides, streaked with ash and flecked with tiny burns. He barely noticed the sting. The adrenaline that had carried him through the fire was now fading, replaced by an exhaustion so deep it felt like it reached his bones. Around him, the neighborhood had come alive. The street that had been eerily still just minutes ago was now crowded with flashing red and white lights. A fire truck sat parked in the middle of the road, its lights casting wild shadows on the nearby houses. Firefighters worked with rapid precision, dragging heavy hoses toward the house, now fully engulfed in flames. Water sprayed in powerful arcs, steam billowing where it met the inferno. Ethan looked toward the ambulance where paramedics hovered over the elderly woman. Martha, he recalled someone calling her. She was strapped to a stretcher, an oxygen mask pressed firmly over her face, and her frail chest rose and fell rhythmically. Alive. He let out a shaky breath. "That's what matters," he whispered to himself, voice hoarse. A small crowd of neighbors had gathered on the lawns across the street. Their faces were lit by the flickering glow of the fire, expressions ranging from awe to unease. Some whispered to one another, stealing glances in Ethan's direction. Others stared openly, their eyes unreadable. He felt their gazes like a weight pressing down on him, but no one approached him. No one offered a hand or even a word. Figures. "Hey!" A voice broke through the haze. Ethan blinked and looked up to see a firefighter standing over him. The man's face was partially obscured by his helmet and soot-smudged gear, but his tone was calm, almost kind. "You all right?" the firefighter asked. "You look like you inhaled a lot of smoke." Ethan nodded faintly. "I'll be fine." "You sure? Let's have the medics take a look at you. Smoke inhalation's no joke." Ethan hesitated, but his body had other plans. Another cough racked his frame, doubling him over. The firefighter didn't wait for an answer. He bent down, taking Ethan's arm gently and helping him to his feet. "Come on," he said. "Let's get you checked out." As they walked toward the ambulance, Ethan noticed more neighbors watching him now. A middle-aged woman in a floral dress stood near the curb, clutching her phone as though debating whether to take a picture. Another man, the same one who had told him to wait for the firefighters, was talking to someone with animated gestures, occasionally glancing in Ethan's direction. The whispers followed him. Was he in there? "I think he went inside before the fire department got here." Crazy. He could have been killed. Brave, though. Real brave. Ethan ignored them. Their words felt strange, like they were talking about someone else. When he reached the ambulance, a paramedic, her name tag read Lucy, stepped forward, her brow creased in concern. "Sit down right here," she instructed, patting the edge of the ambulance bumper. "Let's take a look." Ethan did as he was told, his limbs heavy and uncooperative. Lucy crouched in front of him, pulling a small flashlight from her pocket. She shined it into his eyes, then checked his pulse and lungs with swift efficiency. "You're lucky," she said, standing back up. "Your lungs sound irritated, but it doesn't seem too serious. I'm going to give you a mask to breathe some clean oxygen. It'll help with the coughing." Ethan nodded, too tired to speak. She handed him the mask and adjusted it over his face. The cool rush of oxygen hit his lungs, cutting through the heaviness. He closed his eyes, letting the sensation ground him. "Did you really go in there?" Lucy asked softly after a pause. Ethan opened his eyes and looked at her. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I couldn't leave her." Lucy smiled faintly, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Not everyone would have done what you did. She patted his arm gently. You're tougher than you look, delivery guy. Ethan let out a dry laugh, though it turned into another cough. I'm just stubborn, he muttered. She stood up as a voice from behind them called her name, and Ethan was left alone again. He sat there, staring at the distant flames as the fire crew worked to extinguish them. The house was beyond saving now, just a blackened skeleton of what it had been. Poor lady, a man's voice said nearby. Ethan turned his head to see two men talking by the sidewalk. One of them, an older man with graying hair, glanced at Ethan and nodded. You saved her, didn't you? Ethan didn't respond. He didn't know what to say. The older man held his gaze for a moment longer before shaking his head. Crazy brave, he muttered, turning back to his conversation. The words settled uncomfortably in Ethan's chest. He didn't feel brave. If anything, he felt reckless. He'd acted on instinct, not heroism. He thought of Martha's face, pale and fragile, and how close he'd come to not making it in time. Would anyone even remember this tomorrow? The firefighters would be the real heroes, the ones who battled the flames, who showed up when they were needed. He was just a guy in a dirty uniform who'd gotten in their way. You all right? Another voice asked. Ethan looked up. It was the man with the rake, the neighbor who'd told him not to go inside. He looked uncomfortable now, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. Yeah, Ethan replied flatly. The man shifted on his feet. Look, what you did was brave. I mean, I wouldn't have gone in there. He cleared his throat. Glad she's okay. That's all. Ethan gave a small nod, unsure what to say. The man lingered for a moment, then walked back toward his house without another word. Ethan sat there for a while longer, the mask still pressed over his face. The crowd began to thin as the fire dwindled, replaced by smoke and steam rising into the night sky. Eventually, Lucy returned to check on him one last time. You're good to go if you're feeling up to it, she said gently. But take it easy tonight. Get some rest, okay? Ethan nodded, sliding the mask off and handing it back to her. He stood slowly, wincing as his body protested. The street was quieter now, the chaos fading into a strange stillness. He glanced once more at the ambulance where Martha had been, but she was already gone. As he made his way back to his van, he felt a hollowness settle in his chest. He'd saved her, but it didn't feel like enough. He climbed into the driver's seat, his hands gripping the wheel tightly as he stared through the windshield. The streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement, and the house, now just smoldering ash, was barely visible in his mirrors. No one cheered. No one clapped. Life was already starting to move on. Tomorrow they'll forget. Ethan sighed and started the engine. He was just a delivery guy, after all. Ethan woke to the sharp buzz of his alarm clock. The sound drilled into his skull, slicing through the fog of his dreams. He groaned, rolling onto his back and wincing as a dull ache rippled across his shoulders. Every muscle in his body protested, and the burns on his forearms throbbed beneath the bandages. He blinked up at the stained ceiling of his small bedroom, sunlight filtering through the crooked blinds. It's morning already? The events of the previous night came rushing back. Smoke, fire. The woman he'd carried through the suffocating heat. Martha. Her name still clung to his mind, though he'd only heard it once. He sat up slowly, his body stiff and heavy, as if weighted down by invisible chains. His uniform shirt from yesterday still hung on the back of the chair, reeking of smoke. Ethan glanced at the clock. 6:15 a.m. Like always. Life didn't stop just because he'd run into a burning house. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, wincing again as his bare feet hit the cold floor. In the bathroom, he peeled back the bandages on his arms. The burns were minor, angry red patches dotted with blisters, but they still stung like hell. He splashed cool water on his face, the cold shocking him awake. The reflection staring back at him in the cracked mirror was rough. Bloodshot eyes, ash smudges still clinging to the corners of his face, and exhaustion carved deep into his features. Still alive? He muttered to himself. He grabbed fresh bandages from the cabinet, wrapped his arms carefully, and pulled on a clean uniform. It wasn't much better than the smoky one, faded blue with fraying threads, but at least it didn't stink like fire. Ethan grabbed his keys and his cap, pocketing the last of his spare change before stepping outside. The crisp morning air hit him as he locked the door to his tiny rental house. The neighborhood was as quiet as usual, rows of modest, worn-out homes with cracked sidewalks and overgrown grass. It was the kind of place where no one lingered outside for long. Ethan climbed into his delivery van, its faded logo barely visible on the side, and started the engine. The familiar rumble settled him. Just another day. By mid-morning, Ethan had fallen into the rhythm of his deliveries. The monotony of the job was almost comforting. Pull up, grab the package, ring the bell, leave. Repeat. At one house, a woman with graying hair opened the door as he approached. She took one look at him, at the bandages peeking out from his sleeves, and squinted. "You're the guy from the fire, aren't you?" she asked. Ethan paused, surprised. Yeah, I guess so." Her expression softened. "I saw it on the news this morning. They said someone ran in before the firefighters arrived. That was you." He shrugged, shifting the package in his arms. "I just did what I thought I had to." She nodded approvingly, signing for the delivery. "Well, it was brave of you. Not many people would have done that." "Thanks," he mumbled, suddenly feeling awkward. He turned back to the van, her voice following him. "You're a good man. Don't forget that." Ethan waved without looking back, climbing into the driver's seat. The praise sat uneasily with him. He hadn't done it to be brave or good. He'd just acted. At his next stop, two teenagers on bikes stared at him as he set a box on a porch. One whispered something to the other, and they both snickered before pedaling away. Ethan caught the word hero floating in the air, though it was laced with sarcasm. "You right?" he muttered under his breath. By lunchtime, Ethan's arms felt like lead, and his back ached from lifting boxes. He parked near a gas station and grabbed a sandwich and a cheap cup of coffee. Sitting in the van, he ate in silence, staring out at nothing in particular. The previous night still played in his head. Martha's faint voice, the smoke pressing down, and the moment he handed her to the paramedics. He shook his head, trying to clear it. People didn't stop fires from burning. Firefighters did. He was just there. The rest of the day passed in a blur of stops and starts. A few customers made brief comments about the fire when they recognized him, but the moments were fleeting. To most, he was just another guy in a blue uniform, holding a box. By late afternoon, Ethan pulled into his neighborhood, his shift finally over. The sun hung low on the horizon, draping everything in a golden glow. He turned the key to kill the engine, rubbing his eyes as he slumped against the seat. "Just one day closer to the weekend," he mumbled, reaching for the door handle. Before he could step out, a sleek black car rounded the corner and slowed in front of his house. It didn't belong there. Cars like that didn't stop in his neighborhood. The polished paint gleamed under the fading sunlight, and tinted windows hid whoever sat inside. Ethan frowned, watching as the car pulled to a stop at the curb. The driver's side door opened, and a man in a sharply tailored suit stepped out. He looked out of place, his polished shoes sinking slightly into the cracked pavement. The passenger door opened next, and Ethan froze. It was Martha. She moved carefully, leaning heavily on a cane, but there was no mistaking her. Her pale face was no longer gray and lifeless, though her movements were slow and deliberate. She wore a soft jacket that looked too clean for this street, and her silver hair was pulled back neatly. The man, the driver, closed the door and turned toward Ethan's van, his expression calm but focused. He looked to be in his mid-30s, with the same sharp features as Martha. Her son, maybe. Ethan opened the door and stepped out, his heart thudding with uncertainty. The man approached first, extending a hand. "Ethan Stevens?" he asked. "Yeah, that's me," Ethan replied cautiously, shaking the man's hand. "I'm Andrew Clark," the man said, his voice steady. "This is my mother, Martha. She's been asking to see you." Ethan's eyes flicked to Martha as she smiled faintly. He struggled for words, still trying to process why they were here. "You're okay." "I am, thanks to you," Martha said softly. Her voice was clearer than he remembered, though it carried a delicate edge. "I wanted to thank you properly." Ethan scratched the back of his neck, feeling suddenly self-conscious. I didn't do anything special." Andrew smiled at that, though it was a knowing sort of smile. That's not what we heard, he said. Ethan shifted, unsure how to respond. Martha stepped forward slowly, resting both hands on her cane as she looked up at him. You saved my life, she said quietly. And that's something I won't forget. Ethan swallowed hard, the weight of her words hitting him like a punch to the chest. He glanced at Andrew, who nodded as if to confirm her sentiment. We wanted to stop by, Andrew continued, because there's more to this than just saying thank you. Ethan blinked. More? Andrew nodded, his tone serious. Yes. I think it's time we had a conversation about what comes next. Ethan stared at them, confused but intrigued. The black car sat waiting behind them, its engine idling softly, as if ready to whisk them away again. What do you mean? Ethan asked, frowning. Andrew smiled faintly. You'll see soon enough. Ethan stood frozen on the cracked pavement, staring at Andrew and Martha. The late afternoon sunlight turned everything golden, but the moment felt surreal, like he was watching it unfold through a pane of glass. You'll see soon enough, Andrew had said. But what could they possibly mean? Would you mind if we came inside? Andrew asked, his tone polite but firm. Ethan glanced at his small, run-down house. Its peeling paint and sagging porch felt even more out of place with the sleek black car and sharply dressed visitors standing nearby. He hesitated, embarrassed, but Martha's calm gaze softened him. Sure, come in, he said quietly, stepping aside. Martha moved carefully with her cane, Andrew hovering protectively at her side. Ethan led them into the living room, kicking a worn pair of boots out of the way and grabbing a stack of unopened mail from the couch. Sorry, it's not much, Ethan mumbled as he gestured for them to sit. Martha smiled as she eased herself onto the couch, her movements deliberate but steady. It's home, she said kindly. Andrew remained standing, his eyes scanning the small space as if taking everything in. Ethan suddenly felt defensive, but Andrew's expression wasn't judgmental, just observant. Would you like water? Or, tea? Ethan offered awkwardly. No need, Andrew said, waving a hand. He turned to face Ethan, his posture straight and confident. We're not here to inconvenience you, Ethan. We're here because you've done something that deserves recognition. Ethan frowned, uneasy with the weight of Andrew's words. I didn't do anything special. I just reacted. Anyone would have done the same thing. That's where you're wrong, Andrew replied, his voice steady but firm. You risked your life to save my mother, a stranger. That's not something most people would do. It's extraordinary. Martha chimed in, her voice soft but full of conviction. When I woke up in the hospital this morning, the doctors told me how close I came to, well, not making it. If you hadn't been there, Ethan, she paused, looking directly at him, I wouldn't be here now. Ethan looked down, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. I just did what felt right. That's all. Martha smiled faintly, her eyes shining with gratitude. Sometimes, what feels right is also the hardest thing to do. You could have waited. You could have walked away. But you didn't. Andrew stepped forward, pulling Ethan's attention back to him. Ethan, I run a logistics and supply chain company, a successful one. I deal with deadlines, problem-solving, and people who need to perform under pressure every day. He paused, folding his arms. Last night, I saw something in you. You kept your head when things went wrong, and you acted. That's the kind of person I need on my team. Ethan blinked, not sure he was hearing correctly. Your team? Andrew nodded. I'm offering you a job, Ethan. A real opportunity. Stable hours, solid pay, and full benefits. It's an entry-level management position, but I'd personally mentor you and train you for success. I think you've got the potential to do far more than you realize. The words hit Ethan like a sledgehammer. He stood there for a moment, his mind racing. A job? With you? Yes. Andrew's tone was direct but calm. It's not charity. I'm not doing this to reward you. I'm doing this because I believe you're exactly the kind of person I want in my company. Someone with integrity, courage, and grit. Ethan's first instinct was to laugh, but he stopped himself. Was this real? He'd spent years hauling boxes, surviving paycheck to paycheck, living in a house where the plumbing rattled and the heater barely worked. Suddenly, this man, a successful businessman, was offering him a lifeline out of nowhere. It didn't seem possible. He took a step back, shaking his head. I don't get it. Why me? I don't have experience with business or management. I'm just a delivery guy. You're more than that, Andrew said firmly. You just don't see it yet. Experience can be taught. Character can't. Martha leaned forward slightly, resting her hands on the handle of her cane. Ethan, you stepped into a burning house to save me. That tells me everything I need to know about you. You have a strength that most people don't. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, his pulse quickening. I don't know. This is a lot. I mean, I don't even know if I'm the right person for something like that. Andrew nodded, clearly expecting Ethan's hesitation. I understand. It's a big change, and change is never easy. But let me tell you this. Where you are right now doesn't define where you can go. You have potential, Ethan, and this opportunity could open doors you never thought possible. Ethan's thoughts swirled like a tornado. He looked around his living room, the threadbare couch, the second-hand table, the flickering light overhead, and felt the weight of his life pressing down on him. Bills stacked on the counter. Calls from his mother asking when he'd send her medication money. Nights spent tossing and turning, wondering how he'd ever break free from the cycle he was stuck in. This offer felt like a ladder dropped into a pit he'd been trapped in for years. And yet, something inside him resisted. What if I fail? He asked quietly. Andrew's gaze didn't waver. Then you'll learn, and you'll try again. Failure isn't the end. It's part of growth. Ethan swallowed hard. He wasn't used to anyone believing in him like this. Most people barely noticed him. Neighbors, co-workers, even strangers who ignored him as he handed them packages. And now, here was Andrew Clark standing in his living room, telling him he was capable of more. Think about it, Andrew continued. Take your time. But I believe this could change your life for the better. Martha smiled warmly, her eyes kind. It's your decision, Ethan. But no matter what you choose, I'll always be grateful to you. Ethan exhaled slowly, his mind spinning. I need some time to think. Andrew nodded, slipping a sleek business card from his pocket and placing it on the coffee table. Call me when you're ready. I'll be waiting. With that, Andrew helped Martha to her feet. She turned to Ethan as they moved toward the door. Thank you again, she said softly. You gave me my life back. I hope this opportunity helps you find yours. Ethan watched as they climbed back into the black sedan. The car pulled away quietly, leaving him standing in the doorway, the business card gleaming in the dim light. He stared at it for a long moment, the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. Could he do this? Did he deserve it? Ethan closed the door, the room suddenly feeling both too small and too big at the same time. Ethan sat at his tiny kitchen table, the edges of the sleek business card turning soft between his fingers as he turned it over again and again. Andrew Clark, Director, Clark Logistics. The name felt impossibly out of place here, in his cramped home with its flickering kitchen light and peeling wallpaper. The card was sharp and clean, its bold letters promising a future he still wasn't sure he deserved. His mother's voice crackled through the phone, breaking his thoughts. Ethan, it's a chance, she said softly. There was warmth and trust in her tone, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Why wouldn't you take it? Ethan sighed, staring at the business card. Because what if I mess it up? I don't know anything about management. I barely know how to use a computer for more than emails. There was a pause on the line before she answered. Ethan, all your life, you've done what you needed to survive. You've worked hard every day without complaint. Do you think that man would have offered you this job if he didn't see something in you? I don't know. You do, she interrupted gently. And you're just scared. But it's okay to be scared. Sometimes, fear is how you know something's worth doing. Ethan closed his eyes, letting her words settle in his mind. His mother had always believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. If she thought he could do this, if Andrew and Martha thought he could, then maybe they were right. All right, Mom, he said finally, his voice steady. I'll call him. That's my boy. He could hear the pride in her voice, and for the first time in a long time, it gave him hope. 2 days later, Ethan found himself standing in front of the Clark Logistics office building. It was a polished, modern structure, tinted glass windows reflecting the morning sun, steel edges sharp and pristine. He adjusted his new button-down shirt, tugging at the collar as sweat pooled under his arms. The clothes were stiff, brand new, bought with the last of his savings. He checked the time on his phone, 8:45 a.m. Andrew had told him to arrive by 9 o'clock, but he couldn't bear the thought of being late on his first day. Taking a deep breath, Ethan pushed open the front doors and stepped into the lobby. The receptionist at the front desk greeted him with a warm smile. "Good morning. How can I help you?" I'm Ethan Stevens. I'm supposed to meet Andrew Clark?" She typed something into her computer and nodded. "Welcome, Mr. Stevens. Take the elevator to the 3rd floor. He's expecting you." Ethan's stomach churned as he stepped into the elevator. The ride felt both too short and too long, the gentle hum of the machine doing nothing to calm his nerves. When the doors slid open, Andrew was waiting for him at the end of the hallway. He wore a crisp gray suit, but his smile was friendly, not intimidating. "Ethan," he said, extending his hand. "Right on time. I like that." Ethan shook his hand, trying not to let his grip tremble. "Morning, Mr. Clark. Call me Andrew," he said. No need for formality here. He gestured for Ethan to follow him into a spacious office. Through the glass walls, Ethan could see rows of desks and computers, employees moving purposefully from one task to another. "This is where it all happens," Andrew said as they walked. "We handle supply chains, deliveries, and logistics for dozens of businesses in the region. You'll be learning the ropes here before taking on bigger responsibilities." Ethan nodded, trying to absorb everything. The space buzzed with a quiet energy, nothing like the solitude of his delivery van. It was both overwhelming and exciting. Andrew stopped at an empty desk near a large window and patted the chair. "This is yours for now. You'll be shadowing Anna and her team. She's one of my best managers. No nonsense, but fair." A woman with sharp, confident features and glasses approached them. She offered Ethan a brisk smile and shook his hand. "Welcome to the team," she said. "I'll make sure you're caught up with our systems and processes." "Thanks," Ethan said, feeling slightly relieved by her professionalism. "Don't worry if it's a lot at first," Andrew added. "Take it one step at a time. We're in this for the long haul." The hours flew by in a blur of training modules, introductions, and note-taking. Anna sat beside Ethan, walking him through the company's software system. "This is where we track orders, assign deliveries, and monitor drivers," she explained. "Think of it as the nerve center of our operations." Ethan took careful notes, asking questions when he needed to. Though he struggled at first, stumbling over the unfamiliar software, Anna's patience never wavered. "You'll get the hang of it," she said. "Nobody's perfect on their first day." By lunch, Ethan's head felt stuffed with information, but he hadn't felt this challenged or this alive in years. He ate quietly in the break room, surrounded by employees chatting about office projects and weekend plans. For once, he didn't feel out of place. When he returned to his desk, he found Andrew standing nearby, talking quietly with Anna. As Ethan approached, Andrew turned to him with a grin. "You're doing great so far, Ethan. Keep it up." Ethan managed a small smile. "Thanks, Andrew." "And you have another visitor," Andrew added, tilting his head toward the glass door. Ethan turned and froze. Martha was walking toward him, her cane tapping gently on the tile. She wore a neatly pressed jacket and a calm expression, her eyes fixed on him. "Mrs. Clark," Ethan said, standing quickly. I wasn't expecting to see you." Martha smiled, waving him down. "Please, Ethan, seat." She stopped next to his desk, looking around as if inspecting the space. "How's your first day going?" Ethan shrugged, feeling awkward. "I'm learning. It's a lot to take in, but I'll get there." Martha nodded approvingly. "I have no doubt. You've already shown what you're capable of, Ethan. This is just the beginning." Ethan looked down, her words settling into him like a comforting weight. "Thank you for everything," he said quietly. "I don't think I'd be here without you and Andrew." Martha rested her hand on his desk, her voice soft but steady. "We gave you the opportunity. You're the one who took the risk, Ethan. Never forget that." She straightened up, giving him one last smile before turning to leave. Ethan watched her go, her presence leaving a warmth behind. As he sat back down, Anna returned to his side with a small stack of papers. "All right, break time's over," she said with a grin. "Let's get you handling some real orders now." Ethan picked up his pen, feeling a spark of confidence. He might not know everything yet, but he was ready to learn. This was his chance, a fresh start, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. Ethan's second week at Clark Logistics began with a sense of cautious optimism. He still felt like the odd one out in a sea of experienced employees, but each day, the tasks became a little less foreign. The desk that once seemed intimidating now felt like a place of opportunity. Anna, his supervisor, was a firm but fair leader. She had an uncanny ability to break down even the most complex processes into manageable steps. Under her guidance, Ethan had already mastered inputting data, tracking deliveries, and resolving basic scheduling conflicts. "You're catching on faster than I expected," Anna said one morning as she reviewed his latest batch of completed tasks. "Most trainees need a month before they get this comfortable with the system." Ethan shrugged, a faint blush creeping up his neck. "I just try to focus and ask questions when I get stuck." Anna smiled. "That's exactly what we need. Someone who's willing to learn and adapt." Her words gave Ethan a boost of confidence, though he didn't let it go to his head. He knew he still had a lot to prove. By the end of his second week, Ethan was handling more advanced scenarios, such as rerouting trucks when delays occurred or finding replacements for unavailable drivers. One afternoon, Anna handed him a challenge. A delivery route where a sudden road closure had thrown the entire schedule off balance. "Let's see how you handle this," she said, sliding the assignment across the desk. Ethan studied the problem, his brow furrowed in concentration. He traced alternate routes on the digital map, calculated new delivery times, and reallocated resources to cover the gap. After an hour, he presented his solution to Anna. She scanned his notes and nodded approvingly. "Not bad. You even factored in the fuel costs for the longer route. Most people wouldn't think of that right away." Ethan exhaled, relieved. "Thanks. I just wanted to make sure it was thorough." Anna leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "You've got a good head for this, Ethan. Have you ever considered leadership roles before?" Ethan blinked, caught off guard. "Me? No, not really. I've always been more of a behind-the-scenes guy." "Well, you might want to start thinking about it," she said with a smile. A few days later, Andrew called Ethan into his office. The tone of the email had been casual, but Ethan couldn't help feeling nervous as he stepped inside. Andrew gestured for him to sit. "Relax, Ethan. This isn't anything formal," he said, leaning back in his chair. Ethan nodded, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I've been hearing good things about you," Andrew continued. "Anna says you've been handling assignments with a level of initiative we don't usually see in new hires." Ethan felt a flicker of pride, but stayed humble. "She's a great mentor. I've been learning a lot from her." "That's true," Andrew said. "But she also mentioned something else, your ability to stay calm under pressure. That's not something we can teach, Ethan. It's something you've proven you have." Ethan didn't know what to say, so he nodded quietly. Andrew folded his hands on the desk. "Here's the thing. We have an opening on the coordination team for a junior lead role. It's not something we usually offer to someone this early in their tenure, but I think you're ready for it." Ethan's eyes widened. "A promotion? Already?" Andrew smiled. "Don't think of it as just a promotion. Think of it as a vote of confidence. You've shown us that you're capable of more responsibility, and I believe you'll rise to the challenge." Ethan's chest tightened. He hadn't expected this. Not so soon, not ever really. "I don't know what to say." "Thank you. I'll do my best to prove you right." "I have no doubt you will," Andrew said. Ethan threw himself into his new role with determination. The junior lead position came with more responsibilities, managing a small team of dispatchers, resolving escalated issues, and ensuring daily targets were met. It was daunting at first, but Ethan quickly discovered that his hands-on experience from his delivery days gave him an edge. He understood the driver's challenges better than most and knew how to balance efficiency with empathy. Anna remained a steady source of guidance, but she gave him enough freedom to figure things out on his own. One evening, as he was wrapping up for the day, she stopped by his desk. "You're doing great, Ethan," she said. "Your team seems to respect you, and your problem-solving skills are impressive." Ethan smiled, feeling a rare sense of pride. "Thanks, Anna. I'm just trying to keep up with the pace around here. You're not just keeping up, you're leading, she replied. Amid the whirlwind of his new role, Ethan didn't forget the personal milestone he'd been working toward, arranging his mother's surgery. With the company's health benefits now covering her medical expenses, the process became less daunting. One afternoon, during his lunch break, Ethan called the hospital to finalize the details. Your insurance is all set, the coordinator said on the other end of the line. We can schedule the procedure for next week. Ethan felt a wave of relief wash over him. Thank you. That works perfectly. He hung up and immediately called his mother. It's all arranged, Mom, he said, unable to keep the excitement out of his voice. Next week, you'll finally get the surgery you need. His mother's voice wavered with emotion. Ethan, I don't know how to thank you. You've done so much. You don't need to thank me, he said softly. This is what family does. The day of the surgery came quickly. Ethan took the morning off to drive his mother to the hospital, though she insisted she could handle it herself. He wouldn't hear of it. Let me do this for you, he said firmly. As they sat in the waiting room, Ethan held her hand, trying to keep her spirits high. When the nurse finally called her back, he gave her a reassuring smile. I'll be here when you're done, he promised. The hours passed slowly, but the surgery went smoothly. When the doctor emerged to give him the news, Ethan felt a weight lift from his shoulders. She's doing well, the doctor said. She'll need some recovery time, but everything looks good. Ethan nodded, his throat tight with gratitude. When his mother was wheeled out of the recovery room, she looked up at him and smiled weakly. I told you not to worry, she teased. Ethan laughed, relief spilling out of him. Guess I'm not great at following orders. That evening, as Ethan sat by her bedside, he thought about how much had changed in such a short time. He was no longer the struggling delivery driver, uncertain of his future. He was part of something bigger now, a job that challenged him, a team that respected him, and the ability to care for the people who mattered most. For the first time in years, Ethan felt like he was finally rising to the challenge. A week after his mother's successful surgery, Ethan found himself pulling into the parking lot of an upscale rehabilitation center. The modern glass building sat surrounded by trees, its calm and quiet exterior a stark contrast to the chaos of the night he first met Martha. He stepped out of his car, adjusting the collar of his button-down shirt, a habit he still hadn't shaken, and carried a small bouquet of flowers he'd picked up on the way. Martha had been recovering steadily since her release from the hospital, but Ethan felt a growing need to check in on her. Part of him worried she might still be weak, and another part, a quieter one, wanted to thank her again for everything she had done. Inside, the receptionist at the front desk directed him to Martha's room. He knocked lightly before peeking in. Come in, Martha's familiar voice called. Ethan entered to find Martha sitting in an armchair by a wide window, sunlight spilling across her lap. She looked stronger than before, though the cane still rested beside her. Her face lit up when she saw him. Ethan, what a surprise, she said warmly, gesturing for him to sit in the chair across from her. I hope I'm not disturbing you, he replied, setting the flowers on the small table nearby. I just wanted to check in, see how you're doing. Martha's smile softened. You're not disturbing me at all. I appreciate the visit more than you know. And these flowers, how lovely. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. They're nothing fancy. I just thought they'd brighten up the room. They do. Thank you. Martha studied him for a moment, her sharp gaze still holding that same calm authority. And how are you doing, Ethan? How's the new job treating you? Ethan smiled, genuinely this time. It's going well. I mean, it's still a lot to learn, but I think I'm starting to get the hang of things. Anna's been a great mentor, and Andrew checks in now and then. I like it there. Martha nodded approvingly. I'm not surprised. Hard work has a way of making you feel grounded, doesn't it? It does, Ethan admitted. It's a lot different from before. I've been able to help my mom. She had her surgery last week, and she's recovering well. It's the first time in a long time that I feel like I'm moving forward. Martha's expression softened, her eyes filled with pride. I'm happy to hear that. You've earned this, Ethan, and don't you dare doubt it. Ethan shifted in his seat, glancing down at his hands. I don't know if I've earned it. Sometimes it still feels like luck, you know? Like everything just happened all at once because of that fire. Martha's voice took on a firm edge. Ethan, let me tell you something about luck. It doesn't walk through burning buildings to save strangers. You made a choice that night, a choice most wouldn't have made. That wasn't luck. That was courage. Ethan fell silent, her words sinking deep into him. For a long time, he dismissed his actions as a moment of impulse, an accident of fate. But Martha made it sound like something more, something he could take pride in. Martha tapped the handle of her cane lightly. The fire didn't just change my life, Ethan. It changed yours too. And sometimes that's how it works. You get burned, but you come out stronger, wiser. Ethan looked up, and for a moment, his gaze drifted to his forearm. The burn had healed, but a faint scar remained, pale against his skin, a permanent reminder of that night. You're right, he said quietly, flexing his arm as if testing its strength. That fire, it did change everything. Martha smiled, her eyes twinkling with approval. It's a mark of what you're capable of, Ethan. Never forget that. In the weeks that followed, Ethan continued to settle into his new role at Clark Logistics. The days were long but fulfilling. Each time he resolved an issue or helped his team hit their targets, he felt more confident, more like he belonged. One Friday afternoon, Ethan unlocked the door to his new apartment. The move had been a milestone he didn't think he'd reach so soon. But with his improved salary, he'd managed to secure a small, one-bedroom unit in a clean, quiet neighborhood. It wasn't extravagant, but it was bright and airy, with fresh paint and a small balcony overlooking a park. Ethan set down a box of dishes and took a deep breath. The place still smelled faintly of fresh paint and new beginnings. Not bad, he muttered to himself, a small smile creeping across his face. That evening, Ethan called his mother to update her on the move. It sounds wonderful, Ethan, she said. You deserve it. Ethan looked around the room, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. I'll visit soon, Mom. I promise. You take care of yourself, too, she replied. One step at a time. As Ethan settled into his new home, he found himself reflecting more often on that fateful night. One evening, as he stood on his balcony, the setting sun casting shadows across the street below, he traced his fingers along the faint scar on his arm. The mark had once felt like a burden, a reminder of the pain and chaos of that night. But now, it felt different, like a symbol of everything that had changed. The scar reminded him of the risk he'd taken, the life he'd saved, and the chance that had followed. It reminded him of Martha's words. Sometimes you get burned, but you come out stronger. Ethan tightened his grip on the railing and looked out at the horizon. For so long, he'd been stuck in survival mode, never daring to dream of a future beyond his next paycheck. But now, everything felt different. He had a job where he was respected, a home he could feel proud of, and, most importantly, a belief in himself that had been missing for so long. As the sun dipped below the skyline, Ethan allowed himself to dream of growing in his career, of being someone his mother could always rely on, of building a life filled with purpose. The scar would always be there, a silent reminder of the risk that led to change. But instead of shame, Ethan now saw it as a badge of honor. It told a story, his story, and it was far from over. Ethan's days at Clark Logistics had fallen into a rhythm that felt both familiar and fulfilling. It was hard to believe that only a few months ago, he'd been grinding through life as a delivery driver, unsure of his future. Now, he had a steady job, a team that respected him, and a home that felt like a fresh start. Each morning, Ethan arrived early at the office, often beating the first wave of employees. He liked the quiet before the hustle began, a moment to organize his thoughts, check schedules, and plan the day ahead. His role as a junior lead required him to oversee delivery routes and ensure everything ran smoothly, and Ethan had developed a knack for anticipating problems before they spiraled out of control. One morning, as he sipped his coffee at his desk, Anna approached with a smile. "You're here earlier than me, Stevens." Again, Ethan grinned. "Someone's got to keep the wheels turning." "You do more than that," she replied, leaning against the desk. "I wanted to let you know, Andrew's been noticing your work." He said your coordination with the dispatchers last week saved us from a pretty big client complaint. Ethan blinked in surprise. Really? Really? You're making a name for yourself here, Ethan. Keep this up, and I wouldn't be surprised if you're managing your own team before long. Her words filled Ethan with quiet pride, though he tried not to let it show too much. Thanks, Anna. I'm just doing my part. Anna shook her head with amusement. Well, don't be too modest. People notice when someone puts in the effort. Keep it up. The respect Ethan earned wasn't just from Anna or Andrew. The dispatchers and drivers he worked with were quick to appreciate his leadership style. Firm, fair, and understanding. His background as a former driver gave him an edge. He knew how hard the job could be, and he treated everyone with dignity. Mike's the only lead who actually gets it, one driver, Lucas, said over lunch one day. He's been where we are. It's not just numbers to him. Ethan overheard the comment from a nearby table and couldn't help but smile. That meant more to him than any formal praise. After work one evening, Ethan sat in his living room with his phone in hand, dialing his mother's number. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting a soft orange glow through the window. Ethan, his mother answered, her voice warm and cheerful. How's my boy doing today? Ethan leaned back on the couch, letting out a contented sigh. I'm good, Mom. Busy, but good. I hope you're not working yourself to death, she teased. You deserve a break every now and then. I know, he chuckled. Things are just going really well at work. My team's doing great, and Anna says the higher-ups are noticing. You sound happy, she replied, her tone softening. It's been so long since I've heard you talk like this. Ethan paused for a moment, his throat tight. I am happy, Mom. For once, I'm not just getting by. I'm building something. She sniffed quietly on the other end of the line. I'm so proud of you. Ethan, you've come so far. And it's because of your hard work and heart. Never forget that. Ethan looked out the window, his eyes focused on the horizon. It's been a journey, he admitted. But I think I'm finally starting to see what's ahead. And what's that? A future. A real one. They sat in silence for a moment before his mother spoke again. You deserve all of it, Ethan. And don't let anyone tell you otherwise. I won't, he replied, his voice steady. I promise. Over the following weeks, Ethan's confidence grew alongside his accomplishments. He no longer second-guessed himself when making decisions, and his co-workers began seeking him out for advice. One afternoon, Lucas, the same driver who praised him earlier, approached his desk with a concerned expression. Mike, we got a problem. Truck 18 broke down on Route 7. It's holding up a major delivery. Ethan stood, his mind already racing. All right, let's get it handled. Within minutes, he had rerouted another truck to pick up the stalled shipment and coordinated with a mechanic to prioritize repairs. By the time the issue was resolved, the client had barely noticed a delay. Lucas slapped Ethan's back with a grin. You really don't miss a beat, do you? Just part of the job, Ethan replied with a smile. It wasn't just his work life that was changing. Outside of the office, Ethan found himself living with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He kept his small apartment tidy, decorated with little touches that made it feel like home. Photos of his mother, a couple of books he'd started reading, and even a small potted plant that he proudly kept alive. One weekend, Ethan visited his mother at her home, bringing groceries and a few gifts. When she opened the door, she gasped, pulling him into a hug. Ethan, you look so good, she said, holding him at arm's length. And you're smiling, really smiling. Ethan laughed. Guess life's been treating me better lately. They spent the afternoon together, and Ethan shared stories about his work, about Anna's leadership, his growing responsibilities, and how he was learning something new every day. His mother listened with pride in her eyes, occasionally reaching over to pat his hand. I always knew you'd find your way, she said as they sat on her porch later that evening. You just needed the right door to open. Ethan glanced down at his arm, where the faint scar from the fire still lingered. He traced it absently with his fingers, reflecting on how much had changed since that night. I think sometimes life forces us through that door, he said quietly. That night I thought I was just doing what anyone would do, but it changed everything. His mother nodded, her expression thoughtful. Sometimes The hardest moments show us who we really are. Ethan looked at her, a small smile on his face. And I'm starting to believe that who I am, it's someone I can be proud of. At work the following Monday, Ethan was heading toward the break room when he caught a glimpse of Andrew through the glass walls of a conference room. Andrew was speaking with Martha, who stood tall with her cane, her eyes scanning the floor below. As their gazes met, Martha gave him a small nod and smile, a gesture that seemed to carry a world of meaning. Ethan smiled back, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for her belief in him, for Andrew's guidance, and for the journey that had brought him here. Ethan had spent so long thinking of himself as just the delivery guy, someone who drifted through life without much purpose. But now, he was more than that. He was a team player, a leader in training, and someone who had turned courage into opportunity. It was now a quiet reminder. Sometimes, stepping into the fire is what it takes to change everything. The morning sunlight poured through the large window of Martha's home, filling the room with a warm, golden glow. Ethan sat across from her, sipping tea from a delicate porcelain cup. Martha looked far healthier now. Her cheeks had regained their color, her posture was steady, and her movements confident, albeit slow. Her cane rested lightly against her chair, as if to remind her of the challenges she had faced and overcome. "I'm glad you stopped by today, Ethan," Martha said, her calm voice carrying its usual strength. "I've been meaning to ask, how's everything going at work?" Ethan smiled, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction as he set his cup down. "Better than I ever imagined. I'm leading a small team now. Anna and Andrew have been incredibly supportive, and I feel like I belong there." "You do belong there," Martha replied firmly, her sharp gaze locking onto his. "You earned every bit of this, and don't you dare think otherwise." Ethan nodded, but this time there was no hesitation in his agreement. "I know. I still think about that night sometimes, the fire, the moment I decided to go in. It feels like it happened to someone else. But if I hadn't," he trailed off, staring out the window. Martha tilted her head slightly, watching him. "If you hadn't, where do you think you'd be now?" Ethan's voice softened. "Probably still delivering packages, struggling to get by. I might have given up on things ever getting better. But that night, it showed me that sometimes the hardest choices make the biggest difference. Not just for someone else, but for yourself." Martha nodded approvingly, her expression proud. "Exactly. That's the thing about courage, Ethan. It's contagious. Your choice to act didn't just save my life. It changed yours, and it's inspired others, whether you know it or not." Ethan's brow furrowed slightly. "What do you mean?" Martha leaned forward, her eyes glinting with wisdom. "Andrew told me how some of your team members talk about you. The way you stay calm when things go wrong. The way you treat everyone with respect. You've become a leader not because you were handed the title, but because people see something in you. Courage, selflessness, and a willingness to act when others hesitate. That inspires people, Ethan. That's what builds a legacy." The word struck something deep within Ethan. For so long, he had viewed himself as just a guy who happened to be in the right place at the right time. But Martha was right. His decision that night wasn't an accident. It was a choice, one he made in fear, yet followed through with determination. He let her words settle before finally speaking. "I don't think I ever thought of it that way. I just wanted to do the right thing. Doing the right thing, even when it's hard, is exactly what makes you who you are," Martha said gently. "You've come full circle, Ethan. Now the question is, what will you do with this? How will you pay it forward?" The question lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. Over the following weeks, Ethan couldn't shake Martha's words from his mind. How will you pay it forward? He had spent so much time climbing out of his struggles, stabilizing his life, and helping his family. But Martha's question challenged him to think bigger. One evening after work, Ethan stayed late, walking through the warehouse as the remaining trucks were prepped for the next day's deliveries. He passed a group of younger employees, new hires who reminded him of himself just a few months ago. They were laughing about something, their energy light and hopeful, but Ethan could see the nervousness in their eyes. He knew that uncertainty well. He decided it was time to act. The next day, during a meeting with Andrew, Ethan brought up an idea. I've been thinking about ways we can support the younger employees here, he began. When I first started, I didn't know what to expect. It was overwhelming, but having people like Anna and you helped me find my footing. Andrew raised an eyebrow, intrigued. What are you proposing? Ethan leaned forward. A mentorship program. Pair new hires with experienced team members. It doesn't have to be formal, just someone they can go to for advice, encouragement, and support. I know what it's like to feel lost, to not believe you can rise above where you are. Sometimes all someone needs is a person to tell them they're capable of more. Andrew's expression broke into a slow smile. That's a fantastic idea. Ethan, I think you're the perfect person to help launch it. Ethan blinked. Me? Why not? This comes from your own experience, doesn't it? You're living proof of what mentorship and support can do. Ethan hesitated for only a moment before nodding. All right, I'll do it. The mentorship program rolled out a few weeks later, and Ethan was at the forefront of it. He began meeting with new hires, sharing not just tips about their roles, but also lessons about resilience, hard work, and the value of courage. One afternoon, a young trainee named Sam approached him after their session. Ethan, can I ask you something? Of course, Ethan replied, leaning back in his chair. Sam hesitated, then spoke softly. Did you ever feel like you weren't good enough? Like you didn't deserve a better life? Ethan studied him, recognizing the same self-doubt he had once carried. I did, he admitted, for a long time, but I learned that those thoughts don't have to define you. The truth is, we're all capable of more than we think. You just have to take one step forward, no matter how hard it feels. Sam nodded slowly, his eyes brightening with hope. Thanks, Ethan. I needed to hear that. Months later, Ethan stood on the warehouse floor, watching his team finish up another successful week. Trucks rolled out, employees exchanged cheerful goodbyes, and the hum of progress filled the air. Ethan ran his fingers over the faint scar on his arm, a reminder of how one choice had led him here. That fire had burned away his old doubts and shown him the strength he hadn't known he possessed. It wasn't luck that brought him here. It was courage, action, and the willingness to help someone when no one else would. He smiled as he turned toward his office. He was no longer just the delivery guy. He was a leader, a mentor, and someone who knew the value of lifting others up. Martha's words echoed in his mind. How will you pay it forward? Ethan had his answer. He would continue to inspire, encourage, and lead by example. Because one act of courage could change a life. Not just his own, but anyone's. As he walked through the doors of his workplace, shoulders back and head high, Ethan felt an undeniable sense of purpose. The struggles of his past had shaped him, but they no longer defined him. He was proof that when you step into the fire, you can come out stronger, ready to light the way for others. This story reminds us that courage often comes in moments of uncertainty, when fear tells us to stop, but something deeper pushes us forward. Ethan's journey reflects the importance of stepping up, even when no one else will. One small act of selflessness can change lives, not just for others, but for ourselves as well. It teaches us that growth often comes through hardship, and the scars we carry are reminders of the strength we've gained. More importantly, it challenges us to ask, how will we pay it forward? True courage doesn't just inspire, it multiplies. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end of this story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you won't miss out on more inspiring and heartwarming stories to come. Your support means the world to us.